Can't find my buttons. Here's one. All right, I'm spamming people. Spam. Spam. This is the Twitter spam.
And there's my spam.
Right, it's all about the spam.
There's my.
All right, I've done the spam. Oh, I gotta get the chat up. Let's get the chat up. Here's the chat. Nice. Are you able to see the chat?
I can see the chat. Why am I getting... I'm getting an echo. Hang on a sec.
Mute the tab in Chrome or whatever.
Yeah, that is muted. I don't know why it's not. It must be open somewhere else. Where is it open? Yeah, that is muted. I don't know why it's not. It must be.
It sounds like there's a delay, so it sounds like, yeah, you're transmitting it and then it's coming back through mine somehow.
Yeah, hang on. Just give me 1 second. I don't know where it's coming.
It wasn't happening before we started live streaming, so it has to.
Yeah, so I think there must be a live stream that's like open in the background somewhere. So I'm just closing all my Firefox tabs because it must be hiding in there somewhere. And
okay, million tabs.
Yeah, and like I don't know where it is, but it's there somewhere, and that did it. So that should be good now.
Okay, cool, awesome. All right, well, I'm gonna get things kicked off here. Pushing some buttons. All right. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the live stream. Tonight, we have a special guest on, Justin Alexander from the Alexandrian. You can't see him on screen right now because he's hiding, but we will show him very soon, and it'll be amazing. Basically, we're going to be talking about new Game Master advice tonight, just chatting back and forth. He wrote a book. It's not quite released yet, but it is forthcoming. It is called So You Want to Be a Game Master. It's like, gosh, this thing's huge. It's like over 400 pages of like stuff in there for game masters and stuff. So we'll be talking about that a little bit. We'll be talking about general game master advice, all that kind of cool stuff. But before we get into that, I gotta hit you with sleazy plugs because that's what. Actually, we don't have too many sleazy plugs tonight. The first one is not quite too sleazy. We do have a giveaway going on. There's probably going to be a link in the chat somewhere where you can get in on the giveaway. We'll be giving away a copy of Into the Fae, a level 1 to 5 adventure module. Or you can get store credit on the DM Lair store. It's our standard giveaway that we do every live stream. We will draw the winner to the giveaway at the very end of the live stream. I got a cat bothering me already. It's beautiful. I got 2 cats on, like, check this crap out. Got a couple cats over here in the bed, and then I got my dog, of course, is zonked out. There you go. All right. Let's talk about our awesome patrons. It's patron shout out time. So everybody you can see on screen right here, our wonderful, what does that mean? Somebody said Jason is the GOAT, all capital GOAT. Do you know what that means?
Greatest of all time.
Oh, nice.
So, okay. Thank you to whoever that is.
Cool. Awesome. Anyway, I saw that. I had to say something because I didn't know if that was like a good thing or a bad thing. It's like, should we ban that person? All right. Anyway, wonderful folks' names you can see on screen are our patrons. They help support everything we do around here. They keep the lights on. They also get premium content from us, Lair magazine, and other cool stuff like Foundry BTT modules, which we just began releasing in September. So really appreciate the patrons and the support they give the channel, the business, and everything that we do. And then these folks right here, they are patrons at an even higher level, and they get their names read out loud. I like to think they bribe me to read their names, and it's kind of true. All right, Adam B, Agile Monk, Alessandro N, Alex S, Alexander O, Amanda W, Ambers, Angelique K, Art Soccer, Ashley, Beavish Scon, B in Space, Black Wolf, Bradley H, Bradley A, Brandon P, Brian O, Brian O, Brian the Lion, Carl C, Chris C, Christine B, Christopher G, Colette H, Colin W, Connor D, Contrary Gravy, Courtney H, Dazzled Up, David S, DeWolf, D and B, Derek E, Dice Goblin Wannabe, Dominic S, Don D, Dazim, Dungeon of Terra, Dutch, Ed R, Edward B, Edward L, and Frabo, and Dorian72, Eric B, Erno T, Gabriel T, Gary C, Gene A, Generic Throwaway, George E, George R, Greg P, Guapo, GVTM, Heart Ungaled, Helltong, HLD, Iron Cascade, it's Baoban, Jackie Pizza, Jake L, Jacob K, James C, James L, Jan F, Jennifer M, Jeremy W, Jim P, Joanne P, Joel, John A, John J, John the Wicked, John Pink Skaz, Jonathan F, Jonathan S, Jonathan V, Jordan A, Jose, Joseph H, Joseph W, Josh M, Josh S, Joshua G, Kamata, Kiko Notisutia. Oh, wow, that was bad. Sorry. Kevin F, Killsaber, K, Kirby, Crystal S, Curryclaw, Lauren H, L, Laser Vizund, Lionheart, Linda, Loki, Lord H, Matlock, Macy S, Magna, Marcel V, Matt S, Matthew C, Meepanoned, Meepy, Michael G, Mirostal, Mitchell, Mo20s, Moon, Mordakin, Mr. Owl, Nerd with Glasses, Nerd Over 900, Nicholas S, Nearith, Old Man Mage, PN, Petnik, Pivo, Porkchop Bacon, Puppet Master, Quinn Themo, Randy B, Rebar Runner C, Richard M, Rob W, Robert C, Robin B, Ryan, Saul R, Sakura, Samuel M, Scott R, Shadow, Shane L, Sheila M, A, Simfan, Snapbragger, Soul Bora Gaming, Son of a Sofa Man, Soul Nia, Stan the Man, Stephen or Stefan G, I don't know, Stephen T, Steve L, Steve S, Sturm, Terry V, the Three Quarters Hospital, the Old DM, The Fuzzle, The New Bad Ombre, Thomas F, Timothy T, TK, Travels the Lost, Trinity Series, Tyler D, Tyler R, Unalloyed, The Undying Warlock, Valagor, Victoria Q, Vinny, Vladimir S, Walt O, Wesley K, William C, XX Red Room, Zachary J, Zombie Trami. All right. It's hard to do this when I have a cat in my face. Yay. All right. And he's rubbing against my cameras. Don't rub against the cameras. All right. You're done. All right. Here we go. And here we have Justin Alexander. What's up, dude?
Hey, how you doing?
Great. You sat through the reading. You made it.
You can never have too many patron names at the beginning of your live stream. That's my theory.
Yes. I used to be able to read the red names in under a minute. That was the goal. So I was like, it doesn't happen anymore. And that's a good thing because they support what we do, and I deeply appreciate that. All right, cool. So, ladies and gentlemen, Justin Alexander from the Alexandrian, a blog, a repository of game mastery information. So I'm going to give a brief intro of him while I'm getting my cat out of here, and then he's going to give you a deep dive on what he does around here. What would you say you do around here? I have an office cup. I don't know if you like The Office, but so basically he has an extensive theater and acting background. I was like looking at his bio and I was like, wow, this dude has been in a crap ton of theater and stuff, which is really cool. Which probably helps a lot as a game master. He's also been in the RPG industry for over 2 decades, since 1998. And he has recently, I don't think it's released quite yet, but you have written, and it is about to be released, a new book
November 21st.
November 21st. Beautiful. A new book called So You Want to Be a Game Master. And I got a forward copy of that, what they call them. And I was flipping through this thing, and it is massive. It looks super, super cool. So, Justin, give us the lowdown. Give us some background on, your industry life as a game master and working with gaming companies and crap like that. Just talk to us.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, I kind of broke into the industry back in 1998. I started out doing reviews of role-playing games, built a little bit of a rep for myself, and then began pitching ideas to various companies. The first company that took a flyer on me is DreamPod 9, who does the Heavy Gear and Jovian Chronicles mecha role-playing games.
Okay.
There's actually just been a new edition of Heavy Gear that was just kickstarted. I wrote a couple of books for those lines back in the day. I've also worked for Steve Jackson Games, Fantasy Flight, Now I'm blanking on names. Troll Lord Games. I've done
Oh,
work for them
nice.
as well.
Cool.
And most recently, I've been working as my two most recent gigs are I co-designed the Infinity role-playing game from Modiphius,
Uh-huh.
and then I am currently working as the RPG developer at Atlas Games, where I produce supplements for games like Over the Edge, Unknown Armies, Ars Magica, Feng Shui, and also co-designed the second edition of Magical Kitty Save the Day, which is an introductory RPG aimed at a slightly younger audience. The idea is that if you're a
Uh-huh.
parent with a young kid that you want to introduce to
Yeah.
role-playing games,
Uh-huh.
everyone of any age who loves cats, which clearly you do,
Oh,
Luke,
oh
will love this
gosh.
game.
Uh-huh.
But the goal is to introduce new GMs and new players.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. Wow. So you've worked for a lot of different companies and stuff. That's really cool. What are some of the things you've done that you've enjoyed the most in your RPG career?
That is a great question. I actually really enjoy writing reviews. I mentioned I broke
Hmm.
into the industry doing reviews,
Yeah.
and I think it's partly about there's kind of two facets to that. One
Mhm.
of which is that I love sharing awesome things with people. So I like being able to be like, "Hey, 10 Candles" or
Mhm.
"Alice is Missing" are both fantastic storytelling games, and you should
Mhm.
check those out. The other thing I do enjoy about the review process as well is it also tickles uh, my design energy, because I enjoy getting in there and tearing a thing apart
Mhm.
and looking at how it works, like taking the clock apart,
Yeah.
figuring out how the mechanics work, and then putting it back together again. And so I really enjoy that process of things. And those on my website, the Alexandrian,
Uh-huh.
um, you can actually find where I've done like actual like remixes of adventures from Wizards of the Coast and Pelgrane Press and others. Sort of taking adventures apart and putting them back together in different ways,
Mhm.
sometimes shifting genre, sometimes fixing things or
Mhm.
expanding things. Like, for
Yeah.
example, I did a remix of the amazing Eternal Lies campaign for Trail of Cthulhu from Pelgrane Press by Jeff Tidball, Will Hindmarch, and Jeremy Keller.
Mhm.
And that's a fantastic campaign. I ended up writing additional scenarios for it, creating hundreds and hundreds of handheld props and the like, and then sharing those on my website for people to use. So I really enjoy that kind of like digging into things. In terms of the creative side of
Mhm.
things, one of my favorite things actually is one of those projects I did for DreamPod 9 back in the day. So DreamPod 9's Heavy Gear game had a really cool approach to how to handle meta story or meta plot in their line, because like a lot of RPGs, particularly back in the day, would like have an ongoing story of their game world that would be happening, and Heavy Gear had that, but rather than having every single book in the line sort of follow the to give you a new update to like
Mhm.
force you to buy every single book, they produced these storyline books that were kind of like the history of the world and would help the GM put the world in motion. And so I was a huge fan of these books before I got into the industry. And then once I was in the industry, I was invited to write a few chapters of, I think it was storyline book 4.
Uh-huh.
And that was just a real treat. Like that's kind
Yeah.
of the like if you've ever dreamed of wanting to get into an industry or do
Uh-huh.
something creative, that was really the moment that I got to do the thing that like from the outside as a fan I've been
Uh-huh.
like, wouldn't it be cool to? And then I got to do the thing that was really cool.
Yeah.
I also, the other thing I'm really proud of is, in fact, Magical Kitty Save the Day, which you can see the box for that
Okay.
lurking over my shoulder here.
Uh-huh. Next to the
Um,
Strahd
I'm,
box.
I'm, what was that? I'm
Next to the
sorry.
Curse of Strahd box.
Right next to the Curse of Straw box. Like I think
Yeah.
you couldn't get a stronger
Yeah.
contrast
Uh-huh.
in opportunity there.
Yeah. That's awesome. So for your book, so you want to be a game master. What was like the impetus or the thing that got you going down that rabbit hole? Because that thing's huge. I imagine that took a while to write.
It is huge. It's a project that's been kind of like lurking around on my back burner for a while.
Mhm.
I probably wrote like the earliest material that ended up in So You Want to Be a Game Master was a rough outline of some material back around 2015. But around the time I was trying to work on that, I actually got hired by Modiphius to
Uh-huh.
go do the Infinity role playing game for a while, and so
Yeah.
it got kind of pushed onto the back burner. So it was
Uh-huh.
this project that kind of got pushed onto the back burner several times over the
Mhm.
next few years, and then last year. Elliot at Page Street Publishing contacted me and said, "Do you have a book about GMing that you'd like to write? Because I'm a fan of your website, The Alexandrian." And I
Mhm.
was like, "I do, in fact, have a book
And it's I've been
that I would
writing
like to
it.
write."
Yeah.
So
So
so yeah,
you had a
and
publisher reach out to you that
yes, that's
basically.
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
which is always lovely when that
Uh-huh.
happens that way.
Yeah.
As a freelancer who often has to go hat in hand,
Yeah.
it's definitely writing on easy mode when the publisher comes to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that. So, like, when I was in college, I studied creative writing. That was my degree. And my dream was to write fantasy novels. Like, I grew up reading R.A. Salvatore's, like, Forgotten Realms books. Oh man, that was literally, it changed my life in middle school. I got uh geez man, a second in that series. What is it called? Man, Streams of Silver.
Hmm.
That book, and I have it on my shelf right back there, over there, and it is all beat up and old and yellow paper, and it smells like old book and stuff. And that book like changed my life. Like before then, I think I wanted to be a lawyer or something. And then I got that book, and I was like, oh, this is amazing. And then I found out there were more of them, and this is back in the day before the internet, and so like you did it. The only way you knew that there were more of the book is like in the front of the book or the back of the book, or by going to the bookstore and looking around. And I like devoured those things. So I wanted to be a writer, and write fantasy novels. That's why I dreamed of doing that and went to college for it and stuff. And then in college, I learned to get a book published. Like I don't know if it still works this way, but back then at least, it's like okay, well, so first of all, for fantasy stuff, you got to write the manuscript, right? Okay, then you got to get an agent. So you're sending out query letters to try to get an agent, right? Maybe you get an agent, and then they got to get you before a publisher, right? And then you got to get signed. And then it was like, that's a lot of work. Holy crap, dude. And then if you get that far, it's like, well, I don't know if it still works this way, but back then, the traditional publishing route was if they signed you and they were going to publish your book, they'd give you like, I don't know, 10 grand up front, let's say. And then you get royalties, right? But you only ever make more than at 10 grand if your royalties pass the 10 grand. And then you start making additional. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. It's so much work and you don't get paid anything. Like, and so I was like, that's probably not going to work. So I didn't pursue that. So like when you're talking about having the publisher approach you, it's like, yeah, that's got to be amazing, you know.
100% easy mode, and it still works the exact same way, except you get paid less. So
Wait, how do you
things
get
are just
how do you get paid less?
things are the advances have shrunk over the last 20, 30 years as traditional publishing has shrunk a bit. If you're a
Oh.
mid-tier or entry level author, expect to make a lot less than that 10K that you were mentioning, which used to be a pretty standard
Oh my
uh,
gosh. Why would you do it?
advance.
Like you have to ask yourself, why would you do it, man?
To some extent, you just have to if you're going to do it, you have to
Uh,
have faith in yourself, because like you say, you
yeah.
can earn out that advance, and then hopefully your royalties will take you over the hump. I
Yeah.
will say, like from a purely financial standpoint, um, the way in which I'm doing this book,
Mhm.
maybe I shouldn't say this, but we'll say it, which is that like so the reason I'm doing the book the way I am is
Mhm.
because Page Street works with Macmillan, which is one of the big five, which means that this book is going to be in Barnes and Noble, it's going to be in your local bookstores.
Mhm.
It's going to get in front of an audience that I, working inside the RPG industry, just realistically can't get my stuff
Mhm.
in front of.
Yeah.
And it's an opportunity for me, and this is really what the book was about. It's an opportunity for me to show the way that I think about how new game masters can get into GMing. And my fervent belief that it's a lot easier than sometimes people believe,
Mhm.
because there's this what I want to say here. There's this sort of like mysticism or like Kabbalistic or like occult feeling that like there's these mysteries of the GM and it's all very complicated and very
Mhm.
hard and very stressful.
Yeah.
And I think, and what the book is about is saying, no, there's actually a very simple procedure. You can do this, you can do this, and then
Mhm.
you can be a GM and you can be a successful GM. And there's always new things to learn and new skills to acquire and ways to further your art and your skill as a game
Mhm.
master. But the actual process of being a GM does not have to be as complex or complicated or hidden or shrouded in mystery as we have to do it. And so getting
Mhm.
this book in front of that mainstream audience is really huge for me, to be able to kind of reach out and touch these first time GMs and actually get in front of them.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
that's cool. No, I totally agree. Being a game master isn't super complex, and I feel like to some extent it's possible some folks it puts some like perhaps they see like professional game masters, on Twitch and YouTube doing it and stuff, and they're like, oh, this is the standard and I have to do this, and they're just like, wow, I can never do that, you know, or they, yeah, I think sometimes we we conflate it to be something much more complex than it actually is, and it's really not that hard. But like a lot of things too, you're probably not going to be very good at it when you first do it, and you just got to start, and you get the hang of it. Like I'm into painting miniatures, for instance, and man, I sucked when I first started doing that. It's taken me years to get anywhere near like where I can be like look at something and be proud of it. I think it's like that for game mastering. You have to start. But having resources available is huge because what probably the same for you when you first started game mastering. I don't know how old you were, but like you started in the RPG industry around the time I was in high school, which is when I started game mastering too, but you were in the industry, so you've probably been doing it for more than that. But like there weren't all of these resources. We didn't have YouTube videos. We didn't have internet and blog sites and stuff. And I don't even know if there were game mastering books at the time. I mean, I know they were publishing like, you know, books how to run, like, the Dungeons and Dragons books and stuff, but whether there were books on it or not, I don't know. But now there's like a plethora of information, which is really cool.
So it's actually, I've actually been doing some research lately into like what those early mainstream books for D&D were, and there was a big splurge of them in like the late 70s when the first big bubble of D&D rose up and then burst. I got into playing about 10 years after that, about 10 years before you, 89-90 time frame. This is AD&D second edition was coming out. And the only book I ever found that wasn't a role-playing book that was about running role-playing games was Gary Gygax actually wrote a couple of books, one called Dungeon Mastery and the other was called Role-Playing Mastery. And they're not good books. And unfortunately, but so like, I mean, in terms of like the difficulty,
you got to qualify that. What in your opinion makes them not optimal books for game masters?
Well, so there's a couple things about them. It's been a while since I've actually read the Dungeon Mastery one. I recently tried to reread the Role-Playing Mastery one because I was curious, and the biggest thing about them is that the books are positioned as like, hey, you've never role played before, you've never been a dungeon master before, here's your introduction to it. But the audience that Gary is actually writing the books for is the audience of wargaming grognards who D&D was originally designed for back in 1974. And it's a very strong mismatch between what the promise of the book is in terms of like introducing you to these worlds and what the book actually is, which is a lot of like gritty, like advanced stuff and stuff that like as someone who read the book when I was in fact 10 trying to figure out how to be a great dungeon master, could not figure out what most of the stuff was actually about. So a miss on the audience, I think, is the biggest thing for me on that one. You
bring up a bit of a point about you mentioned like advanced techniques and stuff like that, and one of the comments I sometimes get on my videos is people who are like, Luke, you always just talk about basics, you never talk about advanced techniques and stuff like that. And what always goes through my head is like, what makes a great game master a lot of times is a really good grasp of the basics. Like, you're strong in the basics, you know how to design a good dungeon, you know how to incorporate the pillars, you can do a little like, you know how to role play your villains, and stuff like that, and you're really good at the basics. And then there are advanced stuff, but like most folks, if they were to focus on the basics and stuff, which I would imagine like your book it's positioned toward new game masters, so it's probably going to go over a lot of those basics and stuff. So what do you think are some of the basics of running a game as a game master that new game masters should focus on or think about?
That's a great question. So just to kind of lay out the approach I take in the book, the book is very much focused on get to the table as quickly as you can, because you actually have to do it. Like you say, I mean, if you want to paint miniatures, for example, to take the analogy you used, if you want to paint miniatures, you can read 1,000 books about painting miniatures and watch as many YouTube videos as you want. But before you're going to make any actual progress, you have to pick up a mini and a paintbrush. You have to actually paint your first mini. And when you think about it in those terms, though, in terms of just getting that first one done and not worrying too much about trying to like make it the best miniature anyone has ever painted, but just get that first miniature painted, that's actually a really simple process. You pick up a mini and you slop some paint on it and you're like, hey, at least I got one done. And I probably learned some stuff along the way. And so at the beginning of the book, I say, look, we're going to start out with dungeons because I think there's a lot of reasons why dungeons are ideal for a first-time GM. And I think the fact that dungeons are ideal for a first-time GM is one of the reasons why Dungeons and Dragons is as successful as it is. And the big part of that is that when you're dealing with a basic dungeon, you have a room, and that room is firewalled from the rest of the adventure. Like if I'm running even like a basic mystery, I have to keep in mind like the totality of the mystery in order to run it. If I'm running a basic dungeon, I can look at the room I'm currently in, whether it's filled with monsters or a mystery or a puzzle or a trap or whatever is in that room, and I can mostly just focus on that room. I don't have to think about anything else. It makes it a lot easier, not only for beginning GMs, but any GM to have that kind of firewall where you can just focus on the one thing. So that's where we start, because it's a really convenient place for a beginning GM to not be overwhelmed by the totality of a larger adventure. And I say, look, if you want to run a basic dungeon, there are two skills that you need. And the first skill is how to make a ruling. When the player, because like the basic conversational loop of an RPG is the players say they want to do something, you as the GM tell them what happens, and then they tell you the next thing they want to do. And that's it. That's the whole thing. So the first thing you know is how to make basic rulings. When they tell you that they want to do something, you need to know how to respond to that. So we talk about that. And the second thing you need to know in order to run a basic dungeon is how to run a dungeon room. And then we go over that skill. And this takes about 10, 15 pages. And then I say, great, you now have all the skills you need, plus the rules of the game. All the skills you need to go and run your first adventure. And here's your first adventure. It's called Methods and Magman. Go run it, and then come back. No, seriously, go run it. Put my book down. Go run the adventure, and then come back.
So your book has the adventure in it?
Yeah, my book has a beginning adventure in it.
Cool.
You can obviously use other beginning adventures as well, but whatever beginning adventure you use, go run it. You have to go run that first session, then come back to the book. And that's kind of the foundation of how the book proceeds, is that it is about, it's, there is a section where I talk about more advanced, more general tips and tricks and so forth, but it really is about like, there are these very specific steps that you can follow. And if you do these things, if you know how to make a ruling, you know how to run a room, then you know how to run the game, and you can go and do that. And once they come back out of that adventure, then I talk a bit more about how can we do more with a dungeon than just run these individual rooms. And so I talk about techniques like random encounters and adversary rosters and other ways of making what I call dynamic dungeons, where the dungeon comes to life and there's actual life and motion within the dungeon. And then I talk a bit about advanced dungeons, which is kind of a large umbrella talking about, okay, what about dungeons where you have to make multiple expeditions? What about mega dungeons? What are some basic design principles of dungeons? Like how does nonlinear dungeon design work and that kind of thing? So we talk about some of those skills, and then the book says, hey, we've done dungeons. You hopefully run actually maybe a few adventures now, because I've also talked about how to design your own dungeons and giving you some what I call adventure recipes for doing that. Now that you've done that, you can keep reading the book cover to cover, and we're going to kind of go through some other stuff, or you can pick the type of adventure you want to learn about next. And the book's going to cover mysteries, raids, heists, wilderness explorations, and urban adventures. And you can pick any one of those. Here are the pages you can go to. If you want to run mysteries next, great. If you want to run urban adventures next, great. You can go and do those things. And then I say also there's this extra credit section at the back of the book that has stuff about like creating your first campaign, how to build your world, how to build your supporting cast of and run your supporting cast of NPCs, scenario hooks, splitting the party, that kind of stuff. These skills that are that can apply widely to any type of adventure. I'll also put those there. And again, you can go cover to cover, but you can also begin picking and choosing at this point about which skill set you want to sort of bring online next.
Yeah. And I think, so just going back to the idea of the dungeons, because I want to talk about each of these things you brought up in a little bit more detail. But going back to the dungeons, I think that one of the things you said that I've always been a firm believer in is that there's a lot of reasons that dungeons work. There's a lot of reasons that dungeons are really good design. For instance, sometimes you'll be like, people will be like, I don't know what to do. My players have boots of flying and they're always flying and they're all up in the air. It's like, well, if they were in a dungeon that has ceilings, problem solved. And you're like, well, my players have fireball and it has like a 500-foot range. What do I do? Well, if you're in a dungeon, problem is solved. Okay. Well, it's like my players they're in the city and they're going all over the place and I can't prepare everything. I don't know what to do. Well, if you're in a dungeon, the problem is solved. You know what I mean? And it's like, well, I know there are 3 pillars. I got to do exploration and social interactions and combat. And it's like, how do I incorporate? Well, if you're in a dungeon, the problem is mostly solved as long as you design it with those 3 pillars in mind. So I feel like a dungeon, there's a reason it works really well. You know what I mean? What you said, but it just helps to hit so many different elements of the game. it confines things, like you said, to something that's manageable by the game master, where they don't necessarily feel overwhelmed. Because if the players are in a dungeon, they're in a dungeon. And if it's got 5 rooms in it, and you know what's in each of those rooms, monsters, a puzzle, a trap, or something, and you know how to run those, you're fine. There's nothing else in there you got to worry about. And I've always referred to that concept as like a location based adventure. And you mentioned nodes, and I've not heard of that. I'm wondering if a node based adventure is what I would refer to as an event based adventure. How do you define a node based adventure?
Let me kind of work up to that. So
Okay.
one thing the book talks about a lot is what I call scenario structures.
Okay.
And dungeons are one type of scenario structure, and node-based adventures are another type of scenario structure. And one of the great things about dungeons is that the scenario structure of the dungeon is actually the physical geography of the game world.
Mhm.
Because a lot of scenario structures, you can almost think of them as being, what are the containers?
Mm-hmm.
How are those containers connected to each other in a way that the PCs can move between them and
Right.
navigate them?
Right.
And then what content do we put into the containers? And in a dungeon, the containers are rooms, the connections are corridors,
Right.
and you can put pretty much anything you want to in a dungeon room, whether that, again, a monster, a trap, a treasure, a social situation, whatever that might be. So it's very literal. Now, a node-based scenario is something most people primarily access through when they're trying to design a mystery scenario.
Yes.
So the basic element of a mystery scenario, one of the basic principles I teach in the book, is what I call the 3-clue rule. And that is, for any conclusion you want the PCs to make, the players to make, you should include at least 3 clues. And it basically boils down to the idea of redundancy, that if there's only one clue, then the players might not look for it. They might not recognize that it's a clue. They might misinterpret it. They might ignore it. There's all kinds of reasons why that clue could fail. But if you include 3, you have this redundancy, and it's less likely that the clue will fail.
Right.
And the other nice thing is that we also discover, when you begin designing with the 3-clue rule in mind, that it tends to result in richer and more interesting scenarios, because you are approaching everything from multiple angles, which helps you just instinctively create more well-rounded scenarios.
Right, because if you got to have 3 clues, it forces you to create what those clues are and why it's there and what happened to leave it, and then where it goes and stuff like that. It also seems like it makes it less linear too, because there are different things they could find, and maybe they find this clue. And perhaps if you have different nodes, all 3, look, if you're in one node, let's say it's the kitchen, right? And there are 3 clues in the kitchen, and that's your node. Well, all 3 of those clues don't necessarily have to go to the same node, right? They could take you different places. And so then you end up with an adventure, a node-based adventure, murder mystery in this case, where you could end up going in different directions too. It doesn't always have to go from one to the other,
And that's exactly it. That is node-based scenario design. That you have these different nodes, and these nodes can be locations, they can be events, they can be people, they can be organizations. The concept of a node is very flexible, but you can think of anything node as being as a node is a thing that can be investigated. You can go interrogate somebody, you can investigate an organization, you can go check out a weird location, that kind of thing. And like, to make it formal, I call it the inverted 3-clue rule, which is that if you need 3 clues pointing to one conclusion to make sure that the players reach that conclusion, you can invert that and say, if you're in the kitchen, for example, if you have any 3 clues, no matter what they point to, they'll probably figure out at least one of them,
right,
and then follow that to the next part, to another part of the adventure, to another part of the investigation, where they can continue that investigation. And so that's really the sort of the heart of node-based scenario. And then once you get into it, it's an incredibly flexible structure, because it's basically a dungeon without walls, a dungeon without corridors. You can connect anything anywhere and create this incredible web of interconnected possibility that then you and the players get to explore together.
Yeah, that's super cool. I've always conceptualized that. I call it event-based adventures, but the node makes a lot more sense, I think, in the context. I probably didn't know what it was supposed to be called, and so I made up a word. So, but yeah, that's super cool. I think that I've always found that running a location-based adventure in like a dungeon, we'll say, is always a lot simpler than a node-based adventure. And I feel like one of the reasons is that in a node-based adventure, you got 3 clues, that's great. But sometimes a clue gets misinterpreted, or sometimes the player goes somewhere else just because, and then you're stuck improvising, right? And I think that can be really challenging for first-time game masters, which again brings us to why dungeons are amazing because
Mhm.
there's less improvisation necessarily needed. You know,
You don't have that firewall in the node. You need to keep more of the totality of the adventure in your head in order to not make mistakes, not to get lost.
yeah,
And because the players can go anywhere, it's a lot more difficult to make sure that you're staying on top of everything.
yeah.
So it's definitely more complicated. It doesn't have to be super complicated. There's a tool that I talk about in the book called a revelation list. And
Hmm.
this is basically for each of those conclusions that we're talking about, or in the case of a node-based scenario, each of the places or things that you can investigate, you just make a list of those things, and then you make as bullet points underneath each one, you make a list of the clues.
Right.
And what's nice about having that revelation list is it first lets you kind of diagnose where you're at, like on a basic level, like, oh, they've missed all three of these clues. So I can know right now that this conclusion is a problem and I need to fix it.
Hmm.
The other thing that lets you do though is like when they go off, when they off track isn't quite right because it's no longer really a track, but when they go someplace you didn't expect, you can use that revelation list to be like, okay, well, they're trying to investigate this thing, but they've gone someplace I didn't expect. Can I figure out a way that the thing they're doing, whether that's maybe they went to the local newspaper and are looking up old newspaper articles. I didn't think about that ahead of time.
Hmm.
But I can look at my revelation list and say, well, they could find newspaper articles about this and this.
Right.
And now I can very easily improvise new clues that
Hmm.
point them right back into the heart of the adventure.
Exactly. And that's literally one of the questions I had is for a new game master when they go off track, let's say, how do they improvise and get things back on track? And having that revelation list answers both of those questions because when I'm running an adventure similar to that, like half the time in my brain, my players are doing things and I'm literally like, I know what they have, where they're starting. I know where they're supposed to end up, what the victory condition is. And half of the time they're doing these things and I'm thinking, okay, how do I point them in this direction? What are the clues? Whether it's a murder mystery or not, there needs to be clues or things that will point them in the right direction. You know what I mean? So they can achieve that victory. And so half the time I'm just trying to basically it's not maybe not a written out revelation list, but I have these things and I'm basically trying to be like, okay, what are we gonna do to get them back on track? And so you're just sitting there in your
Mhm.
brain while they're doing the stuff, just like, man, it's fun, but sometimes it can be like, oh crap, what are we gonna do now?
Well, that's really the foundation of the book, which is that the more you understand, the deeper your understanding of these scenario structures, the
Mhm.
easier it is to stay on top of things in the game. Because once you understand how the thing you're doing actually works, the easier it becomes to figure out how to fix something or to get or how to use the tools that you have when you
Yeah.
understand the tools that you have. And I think that's actually I think it's the biggest thing that's kind of missing from the Dungeon Master's Guide, from a lot of the DM advice out there.
Mhm.
Is that sort of practical, like, what is it that we're actually doing? What are we prepping? How do we use that prep at the table? And why are we doing that?
Mhm.
And once you understand that, then you can begin getting artistic with it. Then you can begin improvising. Then you can begin um, breaking the rules when you need to.
Yeah, that's cool. Going back to the idea of dungeons, if somebody wants to design their own dungeon,
Mm.
where should they start? What should they do? Like how do I design a dungeon? I know nothing.
Well, there's a book called "So You Want to Be a Game Master" that you should check out. It comes
Right.
out next month. But yeah, I mean, the short version. So one of the things I do in the book, another concept I have in the book is what I call adventure recipes. And so these are based on scenario structures, but they're sort of a specific collection of containers that are proven to work. A good example that people maybe ought to be familiar with is the 5 room dungeon,
Hmm.
because the 5 room like there's lots of different types of dungeons you can do, but the 5 room dungeon is a very specific set of 5 rooms, 5 very specific containers that you can pour very specific content into and know it will work at the table. And so one of the things I do in the book is I walk through a similar adventure recipe for dungeons that I call the 5+5 dungeon. And so I have a breakdown in the book where I talk about the difference between featured rooms and scenic rooms. Featured rooms are ones where you have multiple things going on and there's sort of meat for the players to chew into. And then you have, and some online advice, people also refer to the scenic rooms as like empty rooms. That's actually also all the way back to 1974 D&D, where Gygax and Arneson refer to them as empty rooms in the dungeon. I don't like the term empty room so much because it often is misinterpreted as literally there's nothing in there. And what they actually are is like, there's just, it's a scenic room. There's stuff in there, but it's not stuff you're going to spend more than maybe like 30 seconds like looking at and processing it. And it can't even be significant. It's just not something you're going to interact with on a deep level, if that distinction makes sense. And so the 5+5 recipe is basically saying take 5 featured rooms and 5 scenic rooms and build a dungeon out of those. And that'll give you a really solid starter dungeon if you're a first-time DM. The book goes into a lot of detail about like different types of featured rooms. So you have I may be a bit down of a rabbit hole at this point off of your question, but the book goes into a lot of things like talking about different ways you can do that. To actually start about where do you actually start designing a dungeon, the first place I start is the concept. And the concept breaks down into location, denizens, and goal. And broadly speaking, that's, where is what location are we exploring, whether that's a ruined castle or a huge underground dwarven city, or just the basement of the local tavern. Those are all different things you could do in a D&D campaign. Who are the denizens? Like, who's actually there that you're going to be interacting with? Anything from giant spiders to cloud giants. And then what is the goal? What is the thing that brought the players to this location, and what are they trying to accomplish? And of course, as you get to more advanced techniques, there may be multiple goals where like there's lots of different things going on, and maybe the PCs help the giant, maybe they're there to rescue the giant spiders. Who knows? But for the beginning dungeon, start with those 3 things. And for location, I don't really have necessarily a good like trick for that one. But there's lots of possibilities, and certainly in some ways you can just go to like a chat GPT online and be like, what's a good dungeon location? And it would feed up caves and castles and so forth.
This is like, if somebody were to ask me like, what's a good location? Or if they were to ask me, what are good denizens to put in the dungeon? Or what's a good goal? My answer would literally be, I don't know, dude, think of it. Be creative. Use your brain. Use your brain and brainstorm something. Like, I can't do that work for you. I mean, I can, and I can publish adventures for you, but that's not the same thing. At some point, you have to like stand on your legs and walk and brainstorm and think of things. But you're right. You can ChatGPT will find you some stuff. You could probably do Google searches and find people have probably made random tables of adventure ideas. I know I have them on my site, so you can totally, there are resources.
100%. I mean, what I do in the book for that is I'm just like, okay, you know what, for this one, here's a page. Here's a page of listing things, and what's on there. There's a castle's oubliette, a subterranean city, cliff dwelling, security vault, colossal body, ship or shipwreck, tower, pyramid, mansion. The list goes on, right?
Right.
For denizens, the tip I give them is actually something, I did a YouTube video about this a while back called the Goblin Ampersand. And the idea is that rather than picking just one thing to put into your dungeon, pick 2 monsters and see what happens when you combine them. So rather than just having goblins, you might have goblins and ogres, or goblins and blink dogs, or goblins and tieflings, or goblins and owl bears. And each one of those is going to give you a different image. I mean, even as I said those things, right? Like when I said goblins and tieflings, you imagined a certain type of ruined castle. But if I say goblins and owl bears, it's a different ruined castle. So that that closure between the 2 different concepts can be really useful. And then if you're like, well, how do I get the 2 different things? Well, I mean, there's a monster manual, right? And you just have to look at the challenge rating appropriate for the adventure. Right. And you have a whole list, and you can even put numbers next to them and then roll a random die. And do that a couple of times, and you'll find something that like sparks your creativity.
Exactly.
And once you've got that creativity spark, then you're in great shape.
Yeah. One of the things, like the thing that inspires me to create adventures and in part to run the game is the monsters, and looking through the monster manual, or the bestiary, and seeing a cool monster and being like, oh man, that's so cool. All right, sweet. And then I'll see another one, and then I'll be like, oh my gosh, that's like a boss right there. Okay. That's a boss. Okay, cool. I want to use that in an adventure. Why? You got to ask the question why. And that goes back to your point about the goal. What is, let's say that it is a fey queen. Okay, cool. So I want to use her as the boss. All right, sweet. Why? she's doing evil stuff. Okay, that's good enough for now. We'll figure out the exact evil stuff later. But let's find some minions for her, right? I need some other minions, some goblins are kind of fayish, and then maybe some corrupted elves or something. And I'll go through the monster manuals and I'll be looking at the challenge ratings, like you said, or the creature level, you know what I mean, to make sure I'm getting enough to properly balance it and stuff. But that's the process, right? Of just looking at this stuff, being inspired, finding cool stuff, and then gathering together the denizens. You know what I mean? And then you figure out why. What is the evil thing the queen is doing? And I feel like an important part too is the evil queen wants to like take over the fiefdom next door. Let's just say, for an example. But the next question is, how does that intersect with the player's characters? How does that affect them, and why do they care about it? You could always just have, your standard NPC quest giver that's like, hey, I need you to help because evil queen type of thing, but there needs to be that why, the problem that's going on, the bad thing that the evil people are trying to do, and then how does that intersect with the players, and why should they care about it, to get that all kind of kicked off,
Yeah, scenario hooks are so important, and they tend to be the thing we have the worst examples of, because when you pick up a published adventure, the writer doesn't know who your PCs are. They know nothing about the situation in your campaign. They don't know what your players care about. So they have to go for like the most generic hooks possible. It's the guy saying, please do this for me because I have no other method for doing this.
Yeah.
So like guy says, please help me, or you're walking down a road and some random something happens and hopefully you'll be interested in it. Tend to be the two big ones, right? And those like they do work, but they're not great as scenario hooks go. When you actually have characters who care about things and are desiring things and have things that they want to accomplish, it becomes a lot easier to make scenario hooks that are aimed at them. And if you take that extra step, it elevates everything that comes afterwards, because then the players inherently care about what's going on. There's actually a whole chapter in the book talking about scenario hooks because I think they are so important as a thing.
Yeah, I think probably one of the most, I don't know if it's the most frequent one, but something that comes up frequently when I do my Q&A streams is the general problem is, Luke, help. My players never go do the thing that I planned for them to do. Like the adventure that I spent hours creating, they never go on that adventure. They go in a different direction, and you can always appeal to the social contract, you know what I mean? Which is fair. But my other retort or response is like, is your adventure hook any good? Is it actually a well-written adventure hook that compels them to go do the thing, And then I usually have three things that I try to include in my adventure hooks. And one of them is be clear about the thing. Like, what exactly is the goal that they're supposed to accomplish, And then you need to have a motivating factor. You need to have a reason for them to go do the thing. And you were touching on that concept a little bit there. In other words, like I can appeal and you can appeal to the characters, right? Some characters just want gold and magic items. Other characters, if you know their backstory, you can put things and appeal to their backstory. Like one character's mom and dad were killed by goblins. All right. Well, if this has to do with goblins, you better believe that character is going to want to go do something about that, So you can appeal to the characters. You can appeal to the players. Some players have certain things they enjoy doing. Like this player loves running heists or something. Well, if you design an adventure that's a heist, they're going to want to go do it. And then you got to tell them where to get started, where to go, point them in the right direction, because sometimes they'll know what the goal is and they'll want to go do it, but they have no idea where to go. And they just wander the game world randomly looking for where to go. And so
yeah, I call those the hook has to be actionable. You have to actually give the PC something they can do. There's a lot of hooks, even in published adventures, I see these where they're like, the lost city of Chandra-La exists. And you're like, okay, but I can't do anything with that. Like, just look for it someplace.
Are we running a hex crawl? Is this what we're doing? Just hex crawling until we find it,
No.
Yeah.
At least give me a compass direction or something. That's all. Yeah. That's all I'm asking for.
So what advice can you give game masters about writing good hooks?
Well, I think part of it, like what you touched on, really, which is that particularly once you're into a campaign, once you get into a campaign, if you just listen to your players during a session, they will often tell you all kinds of things that their character wants to do. There's a magic item that they want, or they want to figure out how to seduce the barmaid, or they want to do any number of other things, right? Whatever their particular goals happen to be. They will tell you those things. They'll discuss them among themselves. And all you need to do is take whatever the thing is that they want and hang an adventure on it. And that's it. The players will provide most of the scenario hooks for you. This is actually one of the reasons why raids are one of my favorite scenario structures, because a raid is basically there's a location and there are bad guys trying to stop you from getting something that's inside the location. Okay. And those are great because basically anytime your players say, I want something, whether that something is a magic item or to kill somebody or whatever the case may be, just take whatever it is they want, stick it inside a raid, and you have your next adventure, right? It's that easy.
So a raid, so you're defining raid as essentially a dungeon, but the objective is to obtain an object or perhaps a specific goal, such as assassinate somebody.
So the key thing is a raid is another form of location-based adventure. The distinguishing characteristic is that when you're running a dungeon or a location crawl, when you go into that location, the expectation is that you don't know anything about it and you're going to explore it. You're going to discover the layout as you go. In a raid scenario, generally speaking, the expectation is that the PCs will know the geography of the location, and it will be much more about planning how and defenses of the location, and it'll be much more about planning how they're going to raid that location. And in a basic raid, that information is basically observable. Like you could put the bad guy's house under observation and see these are the rooms, this is the guard patrol and so forth. The next step up from that is a heist, which works a lot like a raid, but there's additional steps where you have to actually sort of acquire the information about what the layout is. You have to go get the blueprints, you have to do additional research, do surveillance stuff to get it. And so that's the distinction for how those two scenario structures work. And because of those differences, there's different things that you prep and then different ways that you use that prep as well compared to a dungeon.
Yeah, that's super cool. I think you mentioned dynamic dungeons, and I know it's in your book. What is a dynamic dungeon?
So a dynamic dungeon is mostly just a convenient label that I have for sort of a bunch of different techniques that help bring a dungeon to life. Because we talked earlier about how in a basic dungeon, every room is firewalled from itself. One of the consequences of that firewall is that, you put monsters in different individual rooms, for example, and then those monsters all politely sit there and wait for the PCs to come to them. And that works a surprisingly often amount of the time where you do that, and the players won't even realize that the goblins are just sitting there waiting for them to show up. But it is fun when you're just walking down a hallway and some goblins are coming the other direction, for example, right? And so there's everyone knows the technique of random encounters, for example, where you make a random encounter check at some interval, and you can have those random encounters come in. There are more advanced techniques as well. One that I use is called adversary rosters. And the basic idea there is that you actually, if we think about traditional dungeon keying, you key the bad guys to individual rooms. Where that becomes difficult if you're trying to bring a complex to life is you're in room 19 and the bad guy starts shouting for help, or a fight breaks out, or a fireball explodes. And you think, hey, who else would hear this in this dungeon and who should logically respond to it? So you start looking around, but now suddenly oh, well, it's an explosion, so it can be heard 150 feet away or whatever. There's 20 different rooms that are 150 feet away. Let me go check all of those room keys. And suddenly the firewall has literally exploded. And now suddenly you're trying to deal with 20 different who's in those rooms, what would they do, and you get overwhelmed. The adversary roster is an alternative way of prepping that takes the active bad guys out of the room key and puts them in a separate roster. So I'll have a sheet that basically says, hey, there are four mud methods in area 1, there is 2 magmen in area 8, and so forth. And they literally won't be in my room key at all anymore if I'm using an adversary roster. They're just on the adversary roster. And what the adversary roster lets me do is that I can then play those characters like active playing pieces. So I will be able to look at that list and be like, oh, okay, so this guy in area 8, he would hear this because they're in area 19 or whatever. And now I can just actively play that. One thing I'll do, it's really easy on a virtual tabletop because you'll just have all that there, right? But if you're playing at the table, I'll just actually have my copy of the dungeon map, I'll print it out separately. I'll keep it on the table behind my screen, and I'll use little glass beads or even just the miniatures from the bad guys and have them on the map and be able to move them around as well, so I can very quickly see what's going on and move them.
Mhm.
And what that lets you do is just, like I say, it lets you just literally bring smaller dungeon complexes to life. So it's another example, another way you can have sort of a dynamic dungeon as well.
Okay. Yeah. One of the things that I've done similar to that is like I'll print off the map. You know, let's say I'm running Curse of Strahd and I print out one of the maps, and I'll literally like write on the map, you know, little arrows pointing to the rooms, and then what monsters are in those rooms. You know, there's 3 vampires here, and over here there's like this and that, and so then I can look at the map. You know, and if somebody does something, makes noise or something, and I want to pull monsters from somewhere else, you know, I can draw them in, you know, and then have it be a dynamic like that, you know. But you're totally right. Most of the time, if you run a static dungeon, your players are never going to notice. And in fact, they're probably thankful to a certain extent, because if anybody who's ever run an adventure where you're in a combat, right, and then reinforcements start arriving because let's pretend you used the knock spell and it was really loud, or you set off an explosion, or you blew up the exploding barrel or something, and then reinforcements start coming. That's bad, right? So
it can be very, very bad.
Yes, most players are thankful a lot of times for static dungeons. So, like, if I guess why I'm bringing that up is like for new game masters, you know, if you run a static dungeon, there's nothing wrong with that. You know, it's perfectly fine. Players won't notice it. They'll probably be okay with that. You know, the dynamic dungeon, you know, that's probably like pull every so often, do something like that where you're like, let's pull in a room, you know, let's pull in a different room, you know, and add.
You can 100% step it up too. Like another technique you can use at a very basic level. So a couple things. If you're in a static dungeon and you don't want to pierce the illusion of why didn't the goblins come running when we killed those other goblins, one tip to do in designing a dungeon like that is don't put monsters in 2 rooms right next to each other.
Yeah.
So then one step up from that is do that, but in your notes for area 11, for example, say there are goblins in area 12 who will come here. And so you can actually you can re-firewall by adding that information. It's a little bit of extra prep, but if you're trying to figure out how can I step into having these slightly more dynamic dungeons, take that extra step of prep, you can really help yourself during play.
Yeah, absolutely.
As well.
I think too, if your dungeon are made out of stone, that helps a lot. Sound doesn't transmit as well, but also it prevents players from just burning down the entire dungeon, because that sometimes happens, you know,
which is always a valid strategy. Always a valid strategy.
Well, it can be but the issue with that, of course, is that like if you're in a compound and there's a fire, everybody in that compound is doing what? They're converging on the fire to put it out, right? So that could be either good or bad for the players, depending on like whether they were making it as a distraction or whether they thought that, I don't know. So it could be bad. It's like waking the whole dungeon, you know.
Always valid, not necessarily always fun or successful, but the other thing too you touched on though, which is really important when you begin doing these dynamic techniques, whether those are random encounters or adversary rosters or however the dungeon is coming to life, as Nick had said in chat, is that you do have to think about your encounter design as a result. And there's a section in the book where I talk about this. Because if every single one of your encounters is like the hardest possible challenge and every fight the PCs are almost dead when they leave it, then reinforcements are just a terrible idea, because as soon as reinforcements show up, you are overwhelmed, the PCs are going to be wiped out. So there is a different philosophy you have to take if you begin having these sort of flowing dungeons where multiple encounters can join together. The exciting part of that is once you kind of master that skill of building those encounters and running those encounters, and the players begin dynamically responding to those encounters, is it opens up a whole nother level of gameplay. Because like when you're dealing with static dungeon, you're dealing with these solo encounters, you're dealing with what I think of as sort of a tactical component of play. But when you can talk about having multiple encounters and those can kind of sometimes join together and reinforcements coming in, how do we stop the reinforcements and so forth, that adds this strategic level of play, which can be really exciting. And really the one way I think about it is that the players begin having the ability to almost make their own encounters, because they can control to some extent. Are we making a lot of noise? Could we cast a silence spell so we don't have the goblins in room 12 come into room 11, so we can take on 2 easier encounters instead of one tougher encounter? So that kind of strategic stuff can be really exciting for the players once they get over the terror of the ogre smashing down the door and coming in after them.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned something that if every single encounter is super, super challenging, right? That more is going to make it worse. But there's also something to be said just about that variability in difficulty, because if you actually design everything to be super challenging, that can get old fast, depending on your group, obviously. Because players, they like to have the little easy ones every so often. It makes them feel awesome, and then the challenging ones make them feel like they earned their W, so having different challenging, like easier to hard to, is important too,
Well, it's one of the things I love about dynamic dungeons is because things are more fluid and flexible, and because the players have the ability to begin controlling their own encounters, when they do end up with like 2 or 3 different encounters all coming together and turning into a nightmare for them, they don't blame you as the dungeon master for that. They're like, oh, we could have handled that better. And so there's a sense of personal responsibility that then also makes the victory feel really earned by them. Because when I design a really tough encounter for them, and it's clear that like, oh, the DM set this up, and that encounter proves to be too tough for them and they have to run away, I'm the dick. I'm the guy who like designed the encounter badly and they couldn't win it. But when the encounter is tough because they blew up a fireball and then went running around lighting fires in the place and everybody converged in where they were at, that's not my fault. That's their fault. And like, so that's a very different sort of emotional interaction with that in my experience, the players find much more satisfying when I'm not the dick.
Yeah. Or it's like if an enemy escapes, right? He runs away and gets reinforcements. That's our fault. We should have stopped him, And my players scramble to stop enemies that are running away. Oh yeah. So absolutely. All right, we're gonna run on to mysteries a little bit. We did hit that. We actually hit a lot about mysteries already, so we might go on to something else. But we're gonna take a quick little bio break right here, and then we'll be back momentarily. So I'm going to play a nice little video for folks in the stream. Whee.
Are you a dungeon master? Do you want to be a dungeon master? Do you have blue face paint on your face? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, then you're just like me. Not only do you enjoy smashing players in the face with your axe every time they metagame, but you're also a busy person, and while prepping for a D&D game, well, sometimes that's hard. And as much as you'd like to force one of your players to run D&D for a change, well, they all suck, so it's pretty much up to you to be the forever dungeon master. And that's exactly why I get out my crayons every month and write a new issue of Lair magazine. Well, I mean, it's not just me, I have a team of people too. We all get out our crayons and write it, Anyway, every issue of Lair magazine contains 5th edition Dungeon Master resources to help you reduce your prep time while still running amazing games for your lazy, good-for-nothing players. Every issue of Lair magazine contains 2 to 3 adventures complete with maps for online play. We also sprinkle in other stuff like puzzles and traps, which, let's be honest, both suck to have to make yourself. So, I mean, wouldn't you rather just become a DM Lair patron and pay me to write them for you? I mean, my team and I, with our crayons? Now, if you love your wonderful players as much as I do, consider helping me to meet my sales quota by becoming a DM Lair patron today at the link below. You'll get a new issue of Lair magazine every month and other cool stuff like map packs and bonus adventures. Okay, that's it. Please become a DM Lair patron now, or I will find you.
All right. Once he gets back, I think we might start doing questions. So if you guys have questions, I know some people have been dropping questions and we've been ignoring you. Sorry. I think we're going to do some Q&A for a little bit, and then we'll jump back into some other stuff. So if you got questions and we didn't answer your question, feel free to throw it back in the chat, and we'll try to answer it. What is going on? This little guy, he never used to jump up here and bother me, but now he's been doing it like all the time. The little guy. Little guy, you gotta be kidding me here. Wow, my attention. All right, let me go back to Justin's back, so I'll go back to this screen. Whee! All right, I was just talking with chat and telling them we're probably gonna do some Q&A because people have been leaving questions, and
Yes.
We've been ignoring them, so we're going to answer some of those, and then we'll jump into things. Now we talked about we already talked about a lot of the stuff on mysteries, the clues, the node-based adventures and stuff. So we'll do some Q&A, and then I think we're going to talk more about raids and heists, particularly heists. I think will be cool to talk about. So
that sounds great.
Peruse chat here. We had one that I saw. Captain Curve says, "What are some tips for running Find the MacGuffin adventures with a competing adventuring group of NPCs?" Sounds like they're doing Isle of Dread with this idea. So, thoughts, Justin?
Yeah, that's a great one. I actually have a series on my website called Scenario Structure Challenge, where I go through and look at different scenario structures. And one of the first ones I looked at was actually this kind of MacGuffin style play. And there's kind of two different versions of it. One is what I call the race to the prize, and the other is MacGuffin Keep Away. MacGuffin Keep Away is kind of defined as a situation in which there is an item that keeps getting, like, you can take it and try to get someplace with it, but then other teams can come and take it away from you. What is a good example of a MacGuffin Keep Away from, like, literature? The Maltese Falcon. From the Maltese Falcon is the classic MacGuffin Keep Away of all time, where different people throughout the story of the Maltese Falcon have that. And then there was a race to the prize, where, like, this is the Ark of the Covenant from Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where there's a thing that you're trying to get. Although that turns into a MacGuffin Keep Away, I guess, because once they get it, they keep trying to, like, swap it back and forth. So there's a little bit of mixture there. But let's talk about the MacGuffin Keep Away, because I think it sounded like he was mainly interested in that kind of, like, faction-based thing. So the things that make this work is, first off, you want to create an X number of factions. However many factions you want to be seeking the MacGuffins. The PCs will be one of them, obviously. But you want to think about who are the other, probably at least two, but like 3, 4, maybe even 5 different factions who are all trying to get their hands on this item. The second thing you're going to have, obviously, is the actual keep away section. For each faction, you're going to want to know what tactics they use to steal the MacGuffin, whether they prefer stealth or force or the like, and then what tactics they'll use to actually kind of secure that. And then the third thing that's really important for a MacGuffin keep away is to think about the method that is used to find the item when another faction has it. And this is the dynamic that can be really tricky to get right in certain MacGuffin hunts. If it's an arbitrary MacGuffin that you're making up, then you can have it give off a unique radioactive signature, and everyone's got trackers, so you can only keep it away from people for so long, for example. But barring that, you're going to want to think about why when somebody gets it, don't they just disappear and you can never find the MacGuffin again? So you do have to give a little bit of thought to, like, how people will be able to do that. And one solution might be, like, if the PCs have it, then maybe it's like maybe one of the factions is like a global conspiracy with infinite resources, and if they show up on like a security camera anywhere, the game's given away. But you also want to think about how the PCs can track it down. And then the final thing you want to think about is what the actual end game of the MacGuffin hunt is, because you can just play a game where everyone's like swapping the football back and forth, but at some point the scenario has to actually end, right? So part of that's figuring out, like, again, it comes back to what that MacGuffin is and what it is you actually want to do with it. So there might be a finish line where, like, if you're the one who gets it to the haunted mansion in Chicago first, you're the one who owns the mansion now. That's a weird one. Or, like, whatever the case may be, if you're the one who controls things at a certain time, or if you're the one who does something with the item at a certain place, then that's the ultimate goal that you're trying to play off. So think about that. Now, the question is, how do you simplify that structure? So you've got the factions involved. Then you want to play that keep away. If you think about the methods, like we talked about, like the Maltese Falcon, for example, what's the method to find the Falcon? So for the sake of argument, let's say, I think the example I used in the article is actually using, like, Fantasy Flight's Genesis system, but this is not really important. But so imagine you need to achieve X number of successes over any number of checks in order to figure out who currently has the Falcon. So in this case, the players could propose any number of potential things. They could go talk to local contacts in the area, noir style. They could do some kind of research check, that kind of thing. Whatever reasonable checks they could propose, when they reach X number of successes, they figure out where the Falcon is currently being kept. Then when you're actually, so the question then is, once you have all of these different parts and you're actually in the keep away section of it, what is the actual process of running that keep away? And what it's going to kind of boil down to is the GM triggering progressions or different factions, and not always in the sense of the players have the items so a faction tries to come and get it from them. If you have all these different factions in play, the factions should also be interacting with each other. And that's not, you can make those decisions creatively based on what's appropriate for the situation. You might make actual checks for each individual faction to see what their progress is on locating the item, for example. You might just randomly generate 2 factions and say what's going on with those factions at the moment. The last part of this, and kind of gets back to what Luke was talking about earlier in the stream with scenario hooks, is that it's not enough for a thing to happen off screen. If you have 2 factions interacting with each other, that interaction in some way needs to intersect the PCs. They need to see it on the local news, or they need to hear people talking about it, or they need to be contacted by one of the factions in some way. So that's the last part of that you make sure is that, like, if you want to have this sense that all these factions are interactively and dynamically interacting with each other, you need to make sure that when they do interact with each other, that you have that those interactions result in something intersecting the PC so they can see what's happening in the campaign, if that makes sense. Doesn't mean there shouldn't never be any sort of secret developments, but at some point the secret development probably needs to become known to the players, because otherwise it might as well never have happened. So it doesn't have to immediately be known, but there should be a path by which that will eventually sort of cross their path. And then it just becomes actively playing those factions, figuring out who knows where the object is at the moment, giving the PCs a path to finding the object. And if you've got those prep notes about, the method for finding it, who the factions are, and etc., you should be able to have the tools you need to actively play all those different parts in actual play.
Yeah, because like when I'm thinking about that and actually running it at the game table, because there's always theory, and then there's the practicality of running at the game table. And I feel like if my notes are properly done, it will minimize the extent that I need to improvise stuff, right? Because if I just run into that thing and I don't know who all the factions are, or how they're going to try to get it, or different ways that the players could find out where it currently is, I'm going to be improvising my butt off during that game session, which isn't a bad thing necessarily, and some game masters are better at it than others. But if I'm a new game master, let's assume that I'm probably not the best at improvisation, because a lot of times that comes with experience, right? So are there any particular things that could help a game master to prepare thoroughly enough for that situation where it minimizes the amount of improv they have to do?
Yeah, so I mean, to some extent, like, this is probably not a great scenario for a beginning GM, but if you want to try and tackle it, because it's a lot of pieces, like, and it's not firewall in any ways. But okay, so coming back to like the key thing there, think about the factions, because it's really being able to actively play those factions at the table. And active play is something that can sometimes feel very scary to a GM. This thought of like, oh, well, if I don't know what's going to happen, how do I do it? It may help to remember that the players do this all the time, right? The players come to your table and they have a character sheet and they have no idea what's going to happen. You tell them something and they use the character sheet that they have to actively play with you, actively respond to what you're doing.
Right.
And you as the GM can have the same attitude. But you have the advantage that, like, you aren't limited to one character. You have anything you want and anything you can create in the moment to respond with. So a lot of prep for me is thinking about what tools, what toys do I want to play with here. So in this case of this MacGuffin chase, you have these factions, right? Those are my active toys. And I'm going to think about, okay, well, what do I need to prep that would make improv easier? Or what do I need to prep because I wouldn't be comfortable improvising that at the table? So one example here is, okay, well, if this faction, if the PCs have the thing, whatever the MacGuffin is, and this faction comes and wants to take it, what is that method that they're going to use to take it? And that might be, oh, they're going to send in a strike team of ninjas who are going to break into the PC's room and steal it. Or they might send by a bunch of mob enforcers and like confront the PCs in the street and like physically fight them for it. Or they're going to enact a magical ritual, and the PCs will see this MacGuffin float into the air and then begin evaporating into the ether unless they can stop the ritual midway through. Each one of those is, and you want that variety. Like, you don't want every single one of them to be like, hey, it's another team of ninjas. And so if you're not comfortable improvising, pre-planning those different techniques ahead of time will probably be very useful. And then it's not that you're necessarily prepping something specific in terms of like what room is the ninja team going to go into, or what street is the gang going to confront them with, right? Yeah. But you are prepping these tools that will then, you have it's a lot less you have to try and pull out of your butt at the moment that you're running it. You have the tool, you have the toy, you just have to then play with it. So that's one thing. The next thing I'd look at would be is when they get the MacGuffin, where do they take it that the PCs then have to go and take it back from? Right. So there'd be some kind of stronghold or safe house or something like that. Prep one of those, a small, like, little 5-room raid location or heist location or a dungeon of some kind. Prep a little location for each of them where they take the thing and they stick it. And then if you have those two things, you're probably in pretty good shape, because now it's just the only questions you have to answer during play is who has it currently? And then when the PCs find it, you can say, there it is. Or if the PCs have it, you can ask, okay, who finds them first? Which could be as easy as A, you choosing, or B, have a dice table of 1d4 with a list of factions and roll the die. And then the next scene is that faction sending the thing you prepped to come and take it. And so you've got the two things you need, them coming to take it or the PCs going to get it. You've got all the pieces, and now you can really just use those in play.
Okay, yeah, that's super cool. I think that makes total sense. So you want to have a few strongholds, because if a faction grabs it, they're probably going to put it someplace safe, let's say. Or it could be on a caravan, which is like essentially a stronghold in motion or something, but you're going to have a location, So each stronghold potentially has one safe place, and then each stronghold has at least one mechanism that they'll use to get it back from the PCs when they have it, And I feel like if you have those questions answered, and maybe some names of the stronghold leaders in case it comes up or something, you should pretty much be able to run that as you go, because you got all of those pieces figured out. And the only question left is, what order are they going to happen in? And you could predetermine that if you want to. You could randomly determine it, And some of the things that happen are going to have a question mark on them, because if the PCs have it and then the mob enforcers come, they may or may not get it from the PCs, right? So they might have to go to the mob stronghold and get it, or they might not have to. But if the mob enforcers fail, the next street over, that's when the ninjas come, and the PCs are weak, right? And so maybe they end up getting it, and then they go to a different stronghold to get it back. So you could just improvise that as you go. So that totally makes 100%. Sense.
Well, and the amount of complexity you want to get, and then that's the basic version. The amount of complexity you can get can then ramp up as you become more confident within the structure. So, like, for example, the PCs don't have it. I could say, okay, well, what other faction is there a possibility that like the PCs show up at the stronghold for the gangsters and they discover, oh, actually the ninjas already showed up and stole it. And so they show up and all the gangsters are dead and like, oh, well, I guess we're too late. So like that's an option. They could show up in the middle of that fight because you randomly determined that the ninjas found this place. If you have like what the response team is, you can use that response team against the PCs or the NPCs. And then the number of potential scenarios in play is infinite, but the pieces that you're actually having to deal with as the GM are still just those, 4 strongholds, 4 strike teams, and which one do I pick up and play with right now? Or which 2 do I pick up and bash into each other?
One dungeon I remember creating and running for my players basically had to do with the idea that they were to go there to do a thing, but when they got there, somebody else had already gotten there and basically murdered everyone. And then they had totally different situation to deal with. And they thought it was super cool because it totally like upset their expectations of what they were going to do. And so if the ninjas already got to the mob stronghold, the mobsters were all dead. It's like, oh no, somebody else got it. Crap. Now we're back to the, and so that's super cool. And geez, I had another thought along those lines. Oh yes. So this brings up in my mind the question of agency, right? To what extent is it okay to take a little bit of their agency away in these scenarios? And what I mean by that is, for instance, the ninjas show up to take it away from them. Okay, well, is it wrong or right or maybe on the borderline to have the ninjas where there's no way the PCs can even stop them? The ninjas are going to get it, and then they have to go get it back from the ninjas, you know, or should it always be a fair fight? You don't know what's going to happen. So what do you think about that idea?
I think, like, as we were just explaining, we all got very excited about the fact that, like, there were these question marks where we don't know if the gangsters are going to get it. We can also play that the same way in terms of we don't know if the gangsters are going to figure out where the PCs hit it. So I tend to play fair, as you say. I tend to play it as like, let's play to find out, right? And I think when you design your tools so that you can actively play with them, what actually happens in play can never actually derail you or fool you or put you behind the eight ball, because you're always just actively playing, and that's always more interesting to me. So
Yeah.
I would certainly be like, and obviously the players are probably going to try and take some precautions to prevent bad guys from finding them while they have the MacGuffins. And given the nature of the scenario, I'm going to make it it's not going to be easy for them to do that. And one way you can do that is by making sure the bad guys have a variety of ways in which they can track them down, which could range from like ubiquitous surveillance to magical spells to their contacts on the ground to maybe they just have enough people that like they have people out just roaming the streets trying to spot the PCs when they try to move the MacGuffin somewhere. There's a lot of different possibilities there. If you have a variety of those, then that may also tell you, hey, given that the PCs have holed up in a seedy motel on the edge of town, which of these techniques is the one most likely to find them first? Well, if they stay in the hotel, probably not the technique that's a bunch of gangsters roaming the streets looking for them. It's probably the ninjas with their mystic divination spells that locate the MacGuffin first, for example.
Yeah, that's cool. What about the idea of like, so I'm still on this agency thing, right? What if the players are taking these extreme precautions and hiding the MacGuffin? Is it possible that the factions never discover it and it's just a win scenario right off the bat? Like,
possibly, yeah. And I don't think I've ever had that particular. I haven't run a lot of MacGuffin type stuff, so I don't have a lot of actual play like anecdotes. But I know, like, for example, there was a bad guy in one of my campaigns where this bad guy had been built up. Like they were in one of the PC's backstories, killing all their parents. They've been looking for them for a while. They finally figured out where the temple was this bad guy was hanging out, and they snuck into the temple. And they made some really good rolls. They used some silence spells to stop the initial fights from alarming the whole temple. So they got into the inner sanctum with nobody knowing they were there. And they open this door and they see this person sitting on the floor going through these archaeological finds that they have been collecting. And they shoot her in the back of the head. She doesn't even get to turn around and look at them. It was the bad guy. It was just an automatic win. And there's always that worry, like, was that too easy? Is it too much of a letdown? The players loved it. Of course, they loved it because they wanted to do a thing and they did it. And if that happened every single time, that wouldn't be that satisfying. But when it only happens when they earn it and they know they earned it, they love that. And they absolutely hate it when they feel like they earned something and you took it away. You can really lose players' trust a lot if you do that. So yeah, I mean that gets back to the end game portion of the MacGuffin quest, though, which is like, what is the end game? Why do the PCs want it? Why do the NPCs want it? And once you understand what's going on with that, which will depend on the MacGuffin quest, will determine whether or not the PC stuck it in a hole and no one can ever find it. Is that a win? Depends on the nature of the end game. If the end game was actually you have to get the MacGuffin to such and such a place to stop the end of the world, that's not a win condition. You've maybe just delayed things a little bit or made things worse potentially, depending on how things play out.
Dude, this conversation has now made me want to design a MacGuffin quest like that. Like, seriously, that sounds so cool.
It can be. They are a ton of fun.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it'll be more challenging for me to create that adventure than it would be to create one of my standard location-based adventures, but like the possibilities of that and the dynamic element of it just makes it seem super cool, and it'll also be something fresh for my players too, because I usually don't do stuff like that. I don't think I've ever run an adventure like that, so like to do that, it'll be like really cool. So yeah, now you got me excited, man. That sounds awesome.
Roderick asked a great question, which is that in a MacGuffin conflict with several antagonist factions, how do you balance strongholds if the PCs team up with one of the factions? That's another great way in which these MacGuffin quests can turn super dynamic, in the sense that you can potentially have the PCs decide to team up with a faction for some reason, either for short-term game or long-term goals or just temporarily. One of the ways you could handle that, Roderick, would be, well, if the PCs can team up with a faction, then other factions can also team up with each other. So okay, so you've doubled your strength. Well, now the gangsters and the ninjas are going to get together because they have to, because otherwise you're gonna roll over the top of them.
Well, they found out that you teamed up with the other faction, and so they teamed up too. Yeah.
Right, and maybe the first time you hit a stronghold with your teamed up mystic faction that you're with, it works 100%, and that's great. Like you get a big reward for having made this alliance happen. But then the bad guys are going to figure out that there's this team up going on. We're going to have to start forming alliances ourselves. Yeah. So
how would you handle the practicality of running that at the game table? So when I think of players teaming up with the faction, let's say they team up with the ninjas. Okay, great. Now I have 5 players, and they also have a squad of ninjas that go with them. Okay, cool. So now I'm running 10 combatants. I could give the ninjas to my players or something to run them. You know what I mean? But now our combat, and let's pretend that our game system is not well designed for large scale combats, which a lot of them aren't, and so now we have a large scale combat, and then that first compound they hit, it might be a steamroll, right? They're just wiping everything out, and it's like, look at this, we got the ninjas, it's all done. But then once the other factions team up and they're going against compounds or something, now we have like massive amounts of combatants against each other. So there's like, conceptually, the theory is that sounds great on paper, but in practice at the game table, a lot of times those scenarios are boggy and tend to fall flat. So what are the things that we can do to make that more implementable?
Well, this MacGuffin stuff isn't talked about in the book, but there are a couple things in the book that will help with this. And one of these is going to be the heist structure. And if you can set up situations, and a heist structure is a good example of where you can do this in prep. We can set up situations where multiple things need to be done at once. Like at the exact same time. You need to have this diversion. You need to pull both levers at opposite ends of the compound at the same time. Then you naturally create a situation where you need to split up.
Right.
And at that point in this kind of scenario, there's a couple ways that they can split up. One of which is ninjas go do that, and now they're off screen, and you don't have to run a whole combat for them. You can just, figure out what happens in any number of simpler ways.
Right.
Or they might split up and say, okay, you two go with these 3 ninjas, and you 3 go with these 2 ninjas, and we'll split up. In which case, like, handing whichever players aren't in the current scene, giving them the ninjas is a good way to handle that at that point, because now everyone still has a character in every scene.
Exactly, and they're not just sitting there waiting for it to be their turn again. Yeah.
One
of the things that I've done in situations like that, it's a similar concept of 2 levers to pull, so that their NPC helpers are off screen. They're still doing something useful. It's still going to make the job easier for the characters, but you don't have to run up at the game table. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just straight up tell my players out of character, I'll be like, listen, all right, you guys have a band of ninjas, right? And they're going to help you, okay? But here's the thing. They're not going to accompany you on adventures like the same adventure and the same combats and stuff, because it's going to get boggy, and if we're playing 5th edition or Pathfinder, maybe it doesn't work that well in the game system, but you guys decide what you want them to do to help you, and then you can decide, and then it will literally help you. It'll make things easier or something like that. You know what I mean? But so I kind of, out of character, I put that out there so they know that, like, we're not going to implement it a certain way, but this is the way we are going to implement it. So you guys get to decide what it is those ninjas do,
And once you do that too, there's a lot of it becomes very flexible about what the thing is that the ninjas need to do. You can have there's a goal they need to accomplish that they can do while the PCs are doing this thing. There are reinforcements who are coming in, and they're gonna prevent those reinforcements from overwhelming the PCs. There's just a lot of different ways in which once you, I think 100% communicate with the players that, like, we aren't going to have the ninjas on screen, so figure out what goal you want the ninjas to accomplish as part of your heist or your raid or your investigation, and away you go.
It's all you, man. Keep talking.
So Captain says, a case of the real treasure is the friends we made along the way, because they help us murder our enemies. Those are always the best. And of course, that's really kind of as we begin talking beyond the confines of a single scenario, you get into the consequences of what are the long-term consequences of this scenario? How do things pay off, right? And so you ally with these ninjas for this MacGuffin quest. Do those ninjas stay your allies past the end of the MacGuffin quest? Quite possibly, depending on what the basis of your alliance was. And in fact, that might even be, you might even set things up so that when the ninjas are making the alliance, the ninjas are like, you know what, we'll help you accomplish your goals here, but then once this is done, we're going to need your help slaying the mystic purple yeti of the mountains of the east. And then so now you've got, now you've already got that great scenario hook, like we were talking about earlier in the stream. You've got that great scenario hook already set up for your next adventure, where it's based on the players owing a debt, owing a favor to a debt to these people who helped them in their previous adventure. It's not back yet. We'll go ahead, and I see the Firmus Bertman had asked, how do I help coax players into role-playing more at the table? So there's a couple of reasons why players will not be involved in role-playing at the table, and you kind of have to identify why they aren't, why it isn't happening. And there might be several reasons. So like some people are just, shy at the table. And the nature of that shyness can be difficult to deal with sometimes, but I have a great, or nervous at the table. They haven't done role playing before. It's their first time, whatever the case may be. I find it useful sometimes to just make sure that the NPCs talk to specific players at the table. This is also a good way of dealing with situations where like the PCs are talking to some NPC and there's only one player who does all the talking because they're the face NPC. They have the highest charisma score, whatever the case may be in your local system of choice. A really good way to overcome that is just have the NPC like turn to a different PC and say, Louisa, what do you think about this? Or Anton, I heard your father was killed in the Ettenmoor Wars. How do you feel about going back to the Etten Wars, for example? Whatever those contexts may be, use your NPCs to kind of help pull those players out. And actually, another thing I was kind of doing this subconsciously was asking specific questions. Don't just be like, how are you doing today? But be like, again, that Ettensmoor question of like, how do you feel about going back to the Etten Wars because your father died there? That's a specific question that gets the players thinking specifically. It's kind of like firewalling the dungeon from the player side. You're not asking them to take on the totality of all possible role playing. You are giving them a very specific question that they can answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's cool. So where was I gonna go? I wanted to talk more about the heist stuff, but for folks who are just joining us, we're here with Justin Alexander from the Alexandrian. He has over 2 decades of experience in the RPG industry. And as we are seeing, he is a wealth of knowledge. This is really cool. And he has a book coming out November 21st, right?
That's right. Yep.
Called So You Want to Be a Game Master. It's over 400 pages, nearly 500 pages of advice, practical, implementable advice for game masters. It's got mechanics in there. It's got high level, low level. It's got a whole bunch of cool stuff in there. So we've been talking about some of it on the stream. But there are links down in the description as well that you guys can go check it out. It looks super cool. I got an advanced copy and I was looking at it today. It goes into there's some meat in there, guys, so it's pretty cool. I want to talk about heists. So there was a large RPG publishing company released an adventure module that was basically about a heist, and one of the biggest criticisms of the adventure module is that it wasn't actually a heist. So how would you define a heist adventure?
So for a heist adventure, the defining thing for a heist adventure for me is that you have an objective that is inside a location where it has been secured by some defensive measures. And then the nature of the heist scenario is that you have to overcome those defenses and get to the objective. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but the key distinction for me between a raid or a heist, and I can talk about the difference between those two as well, is a dungeon or a location crawl, is that in a location crawl, when you go into the dungeon, you don't know anything about the dungeon. The expectation is you go in, you discover things about the dungeon, you explore the dungeon as part of the adventure. Whereas if you think about a classic heist story like Ocean's 11, for example, by the time they're going on the heist, they already know everything about those casinos. They know where every bad guy is. And the goal of the heist scenario is to put together a plan for how you're going to overcome those defenses. And that key distinction really controls some of the things that you're prepping, and then also how you're using that prep, and also how the players need to approach the scenario in the end.
So when you're designing a heist, when you're prepping it, you're putting those dangers, the challenges in place, but are you also considering different ways they might be overcome as well, like how to resolve them? Like let's pretend that there are guards in a room, right? and they got M4s, and you got to get past them. Are you considering different ways they might be overcome, or are you more or less just plopping them in a room and letting the players figure that part out? Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't.
So there's actually an anecdote I love about this, which comes from Richard Garriott and Warren Spector, who are two video game designers who were working on the Ultima games, which is an old CRPG series.
I love those games. Those are sweet.
Fantastic game.
Yes.
Warren Spector is better known for the Deus Ex games these days, I think, than the old Ultima games, but very similar design ethos. And the design ethos that Warren Spector put forward for those games, I think he learned from Richard Garriott, was that when I make when I put a door in the game and the door is locked, it is my job to provide a key, which may or may not be a literal key. It may be like somebody opens the door for the PCs or whatever the case may be. But in an ideal game, I provide that one solution to make sure it is in fact a soluble problem.
Yeah.
But then if the PCs decide to go grab a cannon and drag it up to the door and fire a cannon at the door and blow the door away, which is something you could actually do in the Ultima games because they were very much about making sure everything made sense in the world. Or if you go outside and climb through the window instead of going through the door, or if you seduce the barmaid so that she opens not the barmaid, the chambermaid, so that she will open, I guess maybe the barmaid has keys too, to open the door of the room. Like, as long as you find that one solution to make sure, okay, there is a solution for this. In the case of like this kind of like heist or raid scenario, then I'm fine just letting the players then figure out if there is another way to do that.
Yeah. Okay. That's awesome. How do you define the difference between a raid and a heist then?
Yeah, so the main difference is so we talked about how like you have this idea of having the information you need in order to make a plan, right? So the distinction between a raid and a heist is largely down to how easy that is to do. So in some ways you can think of the raid as like sort of a basic version of a heist, but the idea in a raid is that you have this objective, and when you show up at the place where it's been placed in there, you can do a survey. And the survey, so basically like you just put on a quick observation and you can very quickly identify where the entries to the building are, most or all of the rooms, what are the passive obstacles, and what are the active forces. Those are the four things I tell you to prep for a raid in the book. And those are the four things that you can basically figure out some or most or all of them by just doing a quick survey. And then the raid is like you go up, you survey the house. It's kind of like a Rainbow Six mission from the Rainbow Six video game, where you can do a quick survey and then go in and do your breach kind of thing. A heist is the main thing that makes a heist more complicated than that is that a heist, you can't do it that easily. Like you can't just look at the casino in Ocean's 11 and know all of the defenses inside the inner vault. So the heist breaks down into kind of 5 phases, and those phases are: first, you identify the score, so you know what it is you're going to go get and where it is. The second thing is you gather information about the score. Optionally, phase 3, you might have an on-site surveillance where maybe there's like a party or something and you attend the party so you can spot where all the security cameras are. That's a classic of the genre. Then you got your prep work, like, okay, do you need to make a fake vault? Do you need to seduce a security guard, whatever the case may be? And then the step 5, you're basically at that point, having done those extra sort of heist activities, you're back at the point of the raid where you have all the information you need to put together your plan and then execute the plan. And one other key difference between the location crawl and a heist or a raid in design is that typically in a dungeon, you are usually expected to like be able to clear the dungeon. In the sense that you go in, you can defeat all the bad guys. Generally speaking, when you're designing a heist, you want to make it so that you can't just walk in and like just beat everybody up, because that's not going to feel like a heist. What do I want to say here? So you want to have enough enemies and have them react dynamically enough in the raid of the heist so that you can't just go in and like mop up the bad guys one at a time, so that there is in fact some need to like figure out how do we either manage their response or how do we avoid them and sneak in.
Okay, so raid, you have some basic information quickly gathered, and you can mostly just go in and like brute force it if you need to. Heist, the challenge is such that if you try to just brute force it, you will probably fail. So it is required to do prep work. It is required to do certain things to overcome those obstacles in advance right? So that when you actually breach and go in, then you are able to overcome those things. Otherwise, if you don't, you're going to fail. So that sounds like the distinction then. Or at least
Yes,
one of them.
exactly. So because
Okay.
like so like I mean the key thing is like you think about like if the defenses are too overwhelming that you can't just stumble your way through stupidly and get lucky. I
Yeah.
mean maybe you could, but like that's not the intention.
Right.
Then in a raid, you immediately know where all the defenses are, and so you need to know those defenses in order to avoid them. In a heist, if you don't do your legwork,
Yeah.
then you won't know where the defenses are, and you will likely stumble into something you aren't prepared for, and the whole thing's going to fall apart very quickly on you.
Okay, cool. So now what happens? How would you run it as a game master if you're doing a heist? Your players do the legwork, they're doing the very best they can, but they miss something. And once they get in there, there's something that just nails them because they didn't figure it out, or their solution to bypass it just didn't work. It wasn't successful. And they quickly find themselves in a situation where the security guards are swarming on them and they're in the vault. And what are we going to do? How would you handle that? Is that a fail scenario? Are you improvising something?
There's kind of two different ways to handle that in my experience. One thing to be comfortable with as a game master, particularly if you're running a campaign rather than a one shot, is I think it's really I think it's fine to be comfortable with the idea that scenarios can fail. You can fail to get the MacGuffin, and you have to flee the scene without getting it, and then the bad guy maybe relocates it or ups his security, and now you've got a different scenario. We have to track it down to a resort on the Mediterranean coast or whatever the case may be. Or you don't have the resources that you thought you were going to have to go raise the army, so you have to find a different way of doing those things. Failure can be very interesting in the sense that it forces you to find another path, and that's both true on the small scale where you try to pick the lock on the door and you can't pick it, so now what is the solution? We have to go maybe climb in through the window, or we need to seduce the chambermaid, and then there's all kinds of consequences that spill out from that, and that's interesting. So it's true on that micro scale, it's also true on a macro scale. So sometimes just be okay with the idea that like not every scenario needs to be a win. Let's see what happens. But there's also another technique you can use, which was innovated by the Leverage RPG. Blades in the Dark also uses it notably, which is a flashback, which is an option I talk about in the book as well when you're running heist. The idea behind the flashback is that you're in the middle of the heist, and if you're in a heist movie, for example, you'll have that moment where everything seems to be falling apart, and then flashback. They go back to the day before, and it turns out actually everything that's happening is exactly according to the plan that we already made. Now, some players really hate this technique, so you really want to touch base with your players about whether or not they're okay with the flashback technique. But when you have a group that is okay with the flashback technique, it can be very powerful. And basically the idea is you're in the middle of the heist, the thing they didn't work, guards are swarming, whatever the case may be. The players have the option of triggering a flashback and saying, actually, 2 days ago, we did this. And you go back and you resolve that scene just like you would in the other. So there's also the chance they'll go back and be like, we planned for this. And then it turns out you didn't plan well enough either. You're still failing, so come up with something else. But the idea is that you can have that heist moment, the classic heist moment from these films, so you have this flashback. So that's an option you can go with. And the way you implement that, there's a couple things you need to do is that first, you need to make sure that a flashback either has a cost or is limited, in my experience. If you just say you can flashback anytime you want to, the players will not feel any stakes to the heist because they'll always know they have a get out of jail free card, if that makes sense. So like the example, like what did I say in the book? For 5th edition D&D, for example, you might limit the group to a total number of flashbacks equal to their proficiency bonus on a given heist, like their highest proficiency bonus. So like if you're in tier 1, it's like a +2, tier 2, you'd have 3 or 4 flashbacks, whatever the case may be. You might further limit them and say, you can do a flashback, but it has to be related to a skill you're proficient in, a class ability, or a background, just to help shape some of what they can do, which will also kind of help shape those flashbacks and also even give them ideas about what they can do. The second thing is that you really need to establish that a flashback can change context, but not continuity. The classic example of this is the security guard walks around the corner and spots you. Well, you can do a flashback and say, actually, I flashed back to meeting him in the bar last night, and it turns out I paid him off and he's working for us, so he comes and opens the door now, which is great. But you can't do a flashback where you say, actually, I killed him yesterday, because we already established he walked around the corner. So like you can't change what actually happened. You can just change the context of it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And then you have to it has to be plausible. Like you can't be like, actually, I am the security guard. Although maybe like there'd be maybe some games where you could do that. And then the fourth is, like I say, I do think it works best when you actually go back and actually resolve the flashback using the mechanics of the game. So use the security guard example again. You go back and try to bribe him. Make your social skill check. If you succeed, you did, and he's here to help you open the door. If you didn't, he took your money, but is planning to still arrest you and do his job. So we'll see how that plays out at the table.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that what you said at the beginning about checking with your players to see if they're okay with it or not is super important, because my gut impulse is, for me, I probably wouldn't like flashbacks, because I would feel like I would feel like the game master is saving my bacon. I would feel like my agency is being taken away because I'm no longer going to suffer the consequences of a bad decision or something. I feel like it's kind of like I'm being coddled. It's like, if we failed, then let us fail. Don't have this thing that gets us out of jail.
Absolutely. And there are also players who it just destroys their ability to role play their character, because they're like, well, but I would have known this the whole time, but I didn't know it. So how am I role playing my character if the character knew they did this, but I don't? It can just completely, for some players, it can completely destroy that for them. Other players don't have that problem. I've run Blades in the Dark, for example. I've run Blades in the Dark for groups where this and the other techniques in Blades in the Dark work great. And I've run Blades in the Dark for groups that are like, this is not for us. We are, Blades in the Dark also uses heist techniques where you don't have to do as much planning. There's additional mechanics for that. The flashback can also be part of that as well. And for some groups, they're like, great, we didn't really like the planning part. We just want the sensation of planning, which things like the flashback mechanic can do. And other groups will be like, I'm here for the planning. Like, if I want to run a heist, I actually want to do the heist myself. I don't want the game plan. So you want to have those conversations about both what you as a GM are comfortable running, but also what the players will find good. And sometimes you'll be like, oh, we had this conversation, but it turns out I thought I'd be okay with flashbacks, but in practice it's ruining things for me. So you do want to not just touch base once, but touch base again and again, and make sure that things are working the way you want them to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's really cool. So, by the way, I have not mentioned this since the beginning of the stream, but we do have a giveaway going on today, guys. There is a link down in the chat somewhere to sign up for it, and we're going to draw the winner in probably about 10 minutes or so. So this will probably be your last opportunity to join the giveaway. You'll get Into the Fae, a level 1 to 5 adventure module, or you can get DM Lair store credit as well. So go ahead and do that. And we also got links down below to Justin's book, So You Want to Be a Game Master, which is coming out November 21st. And almost everything that we've been talking about in this stream, I think, are in this book. So this is going to be a treasure trove of information. I was actually we were talking about all of this, and I have the PDF, but I'm like, I don't like reading PDFs, so I got to get the physical book so I can actually read this thing. Because if this is all in there, then I'm excited. Because I've been game mastering for a while, and I know crap, but there's some of the stuff that we're talking about that's kind of new to me. And it's like, oh man, especially we were talking about the MacGuffin stuff, and I don't know if that's necessarily in the book, but that's a new depth to that. It's a very niche situation, but that's stuff that's kind of new to me, and I'm like, oh, that's really cool,
Well, and that's the exciting thing about these scenario structures. And I will say the MacGuffin one is not in the book.
That's fair.
That one is on my website though, so you can check it out there.
Perfect.
But every scenario structure that you learn or that you create unlocks an infinite number of adventures. Once you know how to run a dungeon, you can create thousands of dungeons. Once you know how to run a mystery, you can do thousands of mysteries. Once you know how to run a heist, thousands of heists. And so every scenario structure takes a little bit of onboarding as you figure out what you need to prep and how you use it at the table and what you can do with it. But once you everyone you bring online is just an exponential increase in what your game becomes capable of.
Yeah, that's super cool, man. All right, so urban adventures. Let's hit this really quick, because it seems like a lot of folks find urban adventures to be super intimidating, hard to run, etc., etc. What are some general tips that we can give folks who are running adventures in urban areas?
So there's actually a very meaty, there's a whole, not just one chapter but multiple chapters in the book talking about urban adventures. And the one thing in the book that's going to be completely new is the section on urban crawls. Now, people talk about urban crawls, but oftentimes they're talking about them in the same sense of like it's an adventure that happens in the city.
Mhm.
The urban crawl in the book is very much about having a crawl structure similar to a dungeon crawl or a hex crawl, where you are actually exploring the city in a geographic sense and keying content geographically, so that it's a campaign about exploring a city. But that's actually a big, complicated kind of scenario structure. It happens late in the book. We build up to it over time, kind of thing. If you're just talking about like, the thing about like how do you handle adventures in the city? The great thing about a city is a lot like a dungeon. You can have almost anything there. You can even have dungeons there, right? Like every building can be a dungeon. So one thing I talk about in the book is the trick to an urban adventure and an urban environment is how do you bring that urban environment to life without being overwhelmed by the massive details? And I think we have time to talk about that a little bit. And so again, it's about what do you prep and how do you use it? And what I tell people in the book in terms of running a city, for the most basic level of running a city, is that you really want to talk about prepping your gazetteer of the city that describes what the city is. And you also want to have some basic encounters that bring the city to life. And so when you're prepping the gazetteer of the city, you want to break the city down into districts or neighborhoods. You don't need a lot of these, but you probably, for like a medium size or a large city, you probably want at least 4 to 6. You can even have as many as 8 to 10 to start with. You may later, if you spend a lot of time in the city, discover you want to drill down and find like more details in there. Like technically, like if you look at like Manhattan, for example, and you just went by the actual neighborhoods in Manhattan, there's like 35 or 40 of them. You don't want that many when you're starting your city out for the first time. It's too much to handle. And in Manhattan, you can still break Manhattan into like, the Harlem, et cetera, et cetera. You can break it down into 4 or 5 sections. Anyways, have those districts, a half dozen of them, let's say. For each district, you want to have the general character of that district, and you want to have a handful of specific landmarks in that district. Once you have that for the half dozen districts, then you want to take a look at the city as a whole and make sure you have the services that players are going to be looking for in that city. Categories I talk about in the book are like, you're probably going to want some hotels and inns because the players are going to want some place to stay. In a fantasy campaign, they're often going to a tavern. They're probably going to want some place to go shopping, and you might break that down by different types of things. So you want to have all those different services that the PCs are going to look for, and you place those within the different districts. They might end up being additional landmarks, or you may have already included some of those as landmarks as you were designing each district. So now you have those districts which describe sort of the geography of the city. And then the other thing you want to have is you want to have some scenic encounters. And you can do big elaborate encounters, but you can actually get away really with the urban encounters. They aren't what I'm talking about are not like full-on combat encounters or interactive encounters. I use the term scenic encounters because it's really just meant to give a little bit of like flavor to the city. It might be like, an urchin boy bumps into you and tries to pick your pocket, or you see a messenger running past you. You see a street magician doing tricks, whatever the case may be, just a little bit of that. Now, there's several ways you can prep these. I won't go into all the details. You can prep just a generic list of maybe a dozen of those for the whole city. Maybe you prep district-specific encounters. You don't have to do a lot of these to get going. You can keep it simple, or you can get more detailed, whatever level of prep you're comfortable with and you want to do that. Now, the reason you have those tools, you have the districts and the landmarks and the encounters, is that there's actually a very simple procedure that I use when I'm running adventures in a city to bring that city to life. And basically what it boils down to is if you think about what the PCs are doing in a city, they are generally going someplace. They are either seeking a service, they're going to one of those shops they want to go shopping at, or they have been given an adventure hook, and so they're going to the haunted brothel on the outskirts of town because that's where the adventure is. But generally speaking, they're in one place and they're going to another. And so bringing the city to life is often about how do you describe the city as you move through it from one place to another.
Right.
And that procedure is name the district, point to it on the map, So, for example, if you're heading to the docks, you say, you're going to the docks.
Yeah.
Having a map is nice too. If you don't have a map, don't worry about it. But
Yeah.
you're heading to the docks. Mention a landmark as they're going. That might be a major street they travel down, a building they pass, an art installation. So, for example, you might say, passing down Fishwives Lane, the smell of gutted tuna hanging in the air. So you head over to the docks, passing down Fishwives Lane, the smell of gutted tuna thick in the air. Then you check to see if there's a scenic encounter on this trip. You can also have one every single trip, but that can sometimes become overwhelming. But you can just make a simple encounter check or just use your gut. Is this an appropriate time for that?
Yeah.
And then just have that encounter as well. So, for example, as you pass down Fishwives Lane, the smell of gutted tuna thick in the air, the encounter then becomes, you see a dragonborn fishmonger offering to sell freshly harvested oyster pearls. He says one of them is a rare rainbow pearl, a sign of good luck. Maybe the PCs choose to engage with that briefly. You have like a really brief, probably role-playing scene with that dragonborn. Maybe they buy a pearl, whatever the case may be. And then they're going to move on towards their goal. And then you're going to describe the location that they arrive in. And that's pretty much all it is. So, name the district, describe the landmark, or maybe 2 landmarks that they pass by on their way there.
Yeah.
Check for an encounter and run that little tiny scenic encounter, and then describe the location that they arrive at. And if you do that, and the key thing is that you do that every single time they go somewhere in the city slowly builds up over time. And the city comes, they learn the geography of the city, and they learn, and the city has life to it as they're moving through it.
Yeah, that's super cool. Like you were explaining all of that, and I'm like, okay, that's exactly how I design my cities, districts, and service. Hey, got it. And then when you got to the random encounter thing, I was like, that's what I'm missing in my cities right there. When they're traveling to this place, I need to have little encounters that give life to the city. Not necessarily combat, but like you said, give life, a scenic encounter. And that's going to allow that to become alive to them. So, yeah.
A great supplement for this is on the DM's Guild, city encounters for Waterdeep. I used this when I was running the Dragon Heist campaign in my D&D game. And this it's a DM's Guild product. I forget the designer on it now, but it's a really great example of the types of encounters you can have.
Yeah.
And also just you can use it as great inspiration to just use it for your own city depending on how things go there. So
yeah, that's super cool. Awesome. We did have a super chat. I want to get to this guy here, and then we're going to be wrapping it up. So the question is, I'm a forever game master, and I finally get to play for the first time in 2 years on Saturday. Any advice? So they're going to be a player for the first time, and they want advice.
that's all. That can be a tricky place. I like to get back into that player mindset. I find, like we were talking earlier in the stream about the fact that like the characters actively play their character, and when I'm in the DM's chair, I am actively playing with all my toys. So when I shift back into the player's chair, it can sometimes be a little bit difficult for me to get back in the mindset if I only have the one toy to play with, my character. So I think for me, the things I'd recommend would be to really make sure that you have some extra depth to that toy, because as a DM, you often get used to like, oh, I only need 1 or 2 things per character, for example, because they're only going to be on screen for a couple seconds. With the PC, you really want to dive a little bit deeper to give yourself more toys within your toys. I think my analogy broke down there somewhere, but like more stuff within that toy to play with, because you're going to want those things in that character. And then beyond that, it's kind of stuff I just recommend to players in general. When you're creating your characters, try to reach out to the other players and see what existing relationships you might have with them. Give yourself some common touchstones. Really make sure that you have some goals as a PC and let the GM know about that. You may or may not. I mean, ideally, you'll get a great GM who will take those goals and find ways to incorporate them into the campaign. If you don't, that's okay too. But ideally you've given them something that they can use for those scenario hooks we were talking about earlier. And I try to find ways to make the GM's life easier if I can, by giving them things that I know I would love to have if I was a GM.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that I love about being a game master is that I'm always playing the game. I'm never waiting, because if my players are talking, I'm listening to them and I'm thinking about what my guys are going to do, right? Or they're planning to do something and I'm thinking, or if I'm actually talking or I'm adjudicating or whatever, like I'm always playing the game. And so when I'm a player, that's not true. A lot of the times I'm waiting because other people are playing the game. And so what I have to do is I have to remind myself, Luke, don't monopolize the table. Shut up, let other people play the game. That's your life as a player. You're gonna be waiting. And so like, because I know that my tendency when I'm a player is to just talk and want to play all the time, and I have to actively stop myself. So I don't know if the person says super chat is like that, but I have to restrain myself, I guess.
There's two things I found useful. One is just to like consciously think about enjoying the audience dance. Think about, hey, I'm really enjoying watching these two characters interact with each other, and like that's not something you often get to do as the game master, because like you say, you're oftentimes like constantly having to be engaged in some way.
Yeah.
But as a player, you can learn to just enjoy. I get to just watch people do these scenes, and then I can find my moment.
Yeah.
The other thing that's also useful too, in terms of thinking about that, is figure out how to pass the ball around. Figure out how you as a player can help put somebody else in the spotlight. Instead of talking to the NPCs, turn to another PC and say, what do you think about this? What do you think we should do? Like we were talking earlier about how to pull shy players out and make them do more role playing. You as a player can also do that at the table by reaching out to players who aren't involved for whatever reason, and making sure that you help bring them into a scene with you.
Yeah, totally. There was another question in here. It said, can you be a bad game master but a good player, or a bad player but a good game master? I feel bored as a player, and I get the feeling I'm not enjoyable to be around. But as a game master, I have more fun. So maybe.
They are different things. They are different roles at the same table. And so absolutely, I think you can absolutely be a person who just enjoys GMing, or a person who just enjoys playing, and that's fine. You'll also find that can also vary sometimes by system, because sometimes different role-playing games or different storytelling games will ask very different things of the players, or very different things of the game master. So it's quite possible to be a great Shadowrun player but a terrible 10 Candles player. But maybe you're a great maybe you're a terrible Shadowrun GM, but you're a great 10 Candles player. Like there's all kinds of different combinations you get into. It's probably about finding the roles you're most comfortable with, the people that you have the most fun playing with, and then also the games that you have the most fun playing. And you really want to experiment and with all those different factors to find the things that you enjoy most.
Yeah, I know that when my personality is different when I'm a game master and a player. As a game master, like if you watch me game mastering, I'm usually like very serious, focused, concentrated, straight face, because I'm working. My brain is working overdrive to run the game, and I'm focusing on running the game. When I'm a player, I turn into this mischievous little chaos gremlin, and I'm the guy who's doing the things that you shouldn't do. There's a magical circle. I step into it and get teleported all by myself into a confrontation that I wasn't supposed to go to. I'm the guy when the other players are like, talking about which door to go in, I walk up to one of the doors and open it because I don't want to wait or something. I'll wait a little bit because I don't want to take the fun away from them, because they are, but like I have a totally different personality when I'm player game master. It's like night and day, I feel like. So, but yeah, I'm probably a borderline problem player at times, just because of that. But, all right, cool. I think we're going to wrap it up there. So, I'm going to draw the winner to the giveaway. While I am figuring out who won the giveaway, Justin, could you just give us the last little spiel about your book and what it is and where they can get it?
Absolutely. So You Want to Be a Game Master is coming out November 21st. It is, like Luke said, about a 500-page long book. It is both for beginning GMs and also for people who are looking to learn new things about the hobby, even if you have years of experience. There's stuff I've packed into here, like new raid procedures, the urban crawl structure, the new adventure recipes like the 5+5 dungeon, and so forth. All of those are completely new things as well. So even if you're a longtime fan of the Alexandrian, I've seen we've had a few Alexandrian fans in here, there's going to be stuff in this book that you have never seen before. My goal was to create the definitive volume on how to be a game master. You'll have to tell me if I pulled it off.
There's so much in that though, because like my team and I literally just got done running a Kickstarter for a game mastery book, and then you wrote one. I know other people, like I have Alexander Macris's The Arbiter of Worlds book, you know what I mean? And like what he writes in his book is amazing. The stuff in our book is different, and I looked at your book and the stuff you have in your book is different, so I feel like you know, there's so much involved that like you have to almost be well read. You know what I mean? So respect that you're trying to accomplish that goal of putting it all in one, but it's almost like, how do you put it all in one? You know, it's because there's
Oh yeah, no,
so much
there's no
cool
way to put
stuff.
it all. I mean,
Yeah.
we touched on it that, you know, like the MacGuffin stuff. I couldn't cram that into the book. There's all kinds of stuff you can't get in there.
Yeah, it's yeah, there's
My
so
goal
much.
my goal is like to give you that firm foundation and also
Uh-huh.
some stuff you've never seen before, and a way of thinking about GMing that hopefully will let you not only use
Yeah.
the stuff in my book, but also go out and use the stuff in other people's books as well.
Yeah.
Like there's actually a whole section they're talking about, hey, look, there's a lot of stuff in this book. How do I keep on top of it all? And I talk about like, well, here's how I add additional skills to my repertoire. I don't do it all at once. These are the specific things I do to try and like
Yeah.
give myself points of emphasis and the like.
Yeah, that's super cool. Yeah, but I'm looking forward to getting the hard copy of this so I can actually dig into
Soon.
it.
Oh, so soon. I cannot wait to
Yeah.
get my copies as well.
Oh, dude, that's the best part about publishing your own book is when you get the physical copy, you're just like, this is my book. And you go to like your wife and you're like, look at my book. And you're like, look at this page, look at this page. You're like, I wrote that and I helped with this. And she's like, okay, that's awesome. Yay. Yeah, that's super cool. The winner of our giveaway is Nicholas from Sweden. Nicholas from Sweden. I will be sending you an email and we'll get you hooked up with some cool stuff. So thank you for hanging out with us and winning the giveaway. And then,
Congrats, Nicholas.
all right, Justin, thank you so much. This has been amazing. We've talked about some things that have helped me learn some stuff about game mastering. So I'm very happy to have you on, man. Thank you so much, dude.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fantastic.
Yeah.
I really appreciate being given the privilege here.
Absolutely. You're very welcome. Stay on the Zoom call. I'm going to close out the stream really quick. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're out of here. Have a wonderful evening, day, night, and stuff, and we'll see you next week.